Consider a proposal for zero tolerance on drunk driving. COSATU Spokesperson Matthew Parks joins us live now to unpack just this. Good evening, Mr. Parks. Thank you very much for joining us on the program. Now, alcohol consumption in the country remains a big focus, especially now it's the festive season. There are concerns that during this period when people are relaxing, that's when they consume the most. Now, you want Parliament to reconsider this specific proposal. Talk to us about this proposal.
Good evening. Thanks for having us, and compliments, best wishes to the listeners. So look, I think the fundamental issue is that we lose about 14,000 South Africans on our roads every year. About 40% of these road accidents, both for drivers, for passengers, for pedestrians, is linked to alcohol. So alcohol has a huge problem to it. Of course, we also know that alcohol abuse, the overconsumption of alcohol has also been a problem with regards to issues of crime, of gender-based violence, especially over the weekends. And we always see, over every festive season, including Easter as well, that our road fatalities spike. Christmas is a little bit more difficult because everybody's on holiday largely, and people are excited, they're happy to be at home, etc., and they do indulge. And look, there's nothing wrong with having a drink. We have a liquor industry which provides a lot of jobs, from our farms to the distribution network to our restaurants, retailers, etc. The issue is how we overconsume alcohol, and the consequences are people die on the roads. So there was a very progressive bill that the President signed into law the past week, the National Traffic Amendment Act. And when the bill was tabled at NEDLAC and then later tabled at Parliament, the Department of Transport had included a very positive clause seeking to reduce the amount of legally allowable or tolerated amount of alcohol in your bloodstream when you are a driver. And unfortunately, that was based upon sound medical evidence, and we had supported it. Given the high levels of number of people who are dying every year because of road accidents linked to alcohol abuse. Unfortunately, when it came to Parliament, our members of Parliament decided to remove it. We think that was a serious blunder. They could rather have reduced the amount because it had opted for a zero tolerance approach. But we do think it's necessary for this Parliament, the 7th Parliament, to reconsider this issue, to really revisit it based upon sound medical expertise and also our support. It says we have a crisis of people dying on roads, and the consequence, the victims of this crisis are families who lose parents, who lose loved ones, who lose breadwinners, who are plunged into poverty, who are having to do with medical bills. The victims are also companies too, who lose valuable workers. The workplace productivity is disrupted. Thus, the economy is also undermined. And of course, the state too must spend very scarce resources paying the medical bills of people who don't have funds for medical care as a consequence of these accidents. So we do think we need to address this issue. I'm not wanting to solve everything, but it is an important step forward in terms of addressing a very unhealthy relationship with alcohol abuse.
Now, Matthew, as per the proposal, what was the legally permissible amount of alcohol that one could have in their system before they get arrested?
So basically right now it's about 0.0 milligrams of alcohol per year in terms of blood content. I think in simple layman's terms, it basically is the equivalent of a glass of wine, of a can of beer. The difficulty there is that people have different tolerance levels for alcohol. People have different body mass indexes. So if you have something very large, who maybe is very tolerant of alcohol, it's not a problem for him to have a glass of wine or beer. But maybe for yourself or myself, we may be less tolerant of alcohol, but what it does do is it impairs your reaction time, it impairs your thinking capacity, your ability, and the consequences when you're driving and you have maybe 2 seconds to respond, to put on the brakes quickly because somebody has walked into the road or a car in front of you has stopped suddenly. That simple 2 seconds, and your ability not to react as fast as you would have as if you hadn't had that glass of wine or a can of beer, there is a consequence. And we're seeing the consequence every year with 14,000 people dying every year on roads, and 40% of that linked to alcohol abuse. And you might also find the situation can also be that the driver is sober, but because the person on the street is drunk, often insanely drunk, there's a consequence. The driver doesn't have space to swerve or to brake at times when that person walks into the street. So we need to address the Amendment Act won't resolve everything, but it would be a useful additional tool for traffic officers, for law enforcement, for the courts to say, we have a crisis as a country. We need to be much more strict and much more harsh in dealing with it until we learn to manage our consumption of alcohol in a much more mature and sober approach.
I mean, as you say, this would have been a noble effort or just something that is included to address the road carnage. But why do you think there was no appetite for parliamentarians to perhaps agree to such?
Look, I think sometimes members of parliament, members of parliament are human beings. They're not perfect. They're not angels. They're like everybody else. They have the blind spots. Some members of parliament would openly say in the committee hearings that they enjoy the glass of wine with a meal, which is nothing wrong with that. But then let's follow the model of very progressive countries like Sweden, for example, which don't allow you to do that. That if you want to have a glass of wine, somebody else must be the driver, not yourself. But I think we should also not be naive and underestimate the very powerful influence of the liquor industry. It is a huge multi-billion-dollar industry in this country. Yep. It has deep pockets. It is able to influence politicians, political parties, the state.
But also contributes immensely to the GDP as well, beyond perhaps maybe influencing the politicians.
And that's what we're saying. There is a space for a legally, a morally bound liquor industry. In the Western Cape, we've got a huge amount of farms which grow wine, a very internationally respected wine, critical part of our exports in many countries. The transport network distribution companies, the retailers, the restaurants, they all depend upon the liquor industry. And especially restaurants, for example, as well, they often make their profit margins on the sale of alcohol that goes with one's meals. But we also need to weigh that up against the consequence to families who lose parents, who lose breadwinners, the consequence to companies who lose employees, and the consequence to the state, which just doesn't have the spare money of having to pay for the medical costs. So we need to find the right balance. And right now, we can't go to either extreme. The one extreme would be ban the liquor industry, which you can't do. Would be a silly option. But the other extreme is what we're doing right now, which is simply say, it's okay to get drunk. It's okay to get drunk and then to drive or to walk, and not to think about the people who pay the price, which is the families, the children, the companies, the economy, the state, who are not part of that conversation of getting drunk. And we're not saying don't drink. We're just saying we have a mature and responsible relationship.
All right.
And we need to learn from international best practice too as well.
All right, Matthew, thank you very much for joining us on the program. That was Matthew Parks, COSATU spokesperson.